Margaret Henson had spent most of her life in Millbrook, a quiet town where people still waved to each other on the street and left their doors unlocked. At 67, she lived in a small but cozy single-story home on the edge of town. Surrounded by a neatly kept garden she tended herself. Her daughter, Ellen, was her closest companion. Ellen, 34, worked part-time at a local grocery store and spent much of her free time with her mother, especially since Margaret's health had started to decline. Life was simple for them, predictable in the way small-town life often is. That all began to change when Robert Kane returned. Robert had once been a part of Margaret's life many years ago. They met in their youth, when Margaret worked as a nurse and Robert was a smooth-talking man with restless ambition. Their relationship had been brief, but intense, ending abruptly when Robert's troubles with the law began. He drifted in and out of her life, before finally disappearing altogether after being sentenced to 15 years in prison for armed robbery. For over a decade, there was no contact, until one day, a letter arrived. The letter was unexpected, written in careful, almost formal handwriting. Robert claimed to have changed. He told her he had spent his years behind bars reflecting on his mistakes and finding faith in a new path forward. He spoke of regret, of wanting to reconnect with someone who had once shown him kindness. Margaret read his words more than once, hesitant yet curious. Loneliness had a way of softening her caution, and soon they began exchanging letters regularly. His words made her feel remembered, valued. For months they corresponded, until the day came when Robert wrote to tell her he would soon be released. When he finally walked out of the prison gates, Margaret was waiting for him. She had made the drive herself, wearing a pale blue cardigan and clutching a thermos of coffee. Robert looked older, thinner, but his smile was wide and familiar. Without hesitation, she offered him a place to stay, telling herself that everyone deserved a second chance. She even told Ellen that it would be good for the house to have another person in it, someone to help with the heavier chores. Ellen, though skeptical, kept her reservations to herself, not wanting to dampen her mother's happiness. The first day after his release was quiet. Robert stayed in the spare bedroom. Margaret had prepared for him, unpacking his few belongings: a small duffel bag, a stack of books, and a pair of worn boots. He spoke little but thanked her repeatedly, saying it felt strange to be free again. Margaret cooked him a warm dinner, and for a brief moment it felt as if this could work. She noticed, however, that he seemed distracted, his eyes often fixed on the floor as if his thoughts were somewhere far away. By the second day, he appeared more settled. He wandered into the garden in the morning, watching Margaret water her roses, and even offered to fix a loose step on the porch. He stayed close to the house, avoiding the neighbors, though Margaret thought it was simply because he needed time to adjust. She was proud of her decision to help him, believing she might be part of his redemption story. Yet, under the calm surface, there were things she could not see. Robert had been released with no job, no money, and no plan, except the one forming quietly in his mind. Old habits and darker thoughts still clung to him. The way he moved through the house, taking in every detail, was not just a matter of becoming familiar with his surroundings. It was a calculated observation. He noted where Margaret kept her mail, the small wooden box where she stored important documents, and the locked drawer in the hallway cabinet. Margaret remained blissfully unaware of the weight of his stare. To her, he was just a man in need, grateful to be given shelter. She had spent her life caring for others, both as a nurse and as a mother, and she saw no reason to stop now. What she could not know was that in just a matter of days, her kindness would become the very thing that placed her and Ellen in unimaginable danger. In her mind, the home she opened to him was a sanctuary. In his, it was the first step in a plan that had nothing to do with starting over and everything to do with taking what he believed should be his. Robert's transformation over the following day was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't looking closely. Margaret noticed only that he seemed quieter, as if he was still trying to get used to life outside prison walls. She attributed his silences to exhaustion, or the mental strain of adjusting to freedom. But behind the stillness, His thoughts had taken a darker turn. The first waves of gratitude he had felt toward Margaret for taking him in were already fading, replaced by a simmering hunger for security, and the fastest way to get it. He had never been the kind of man to wait patiently for things to fall into place. Waiting, he believed, was for people who had nothing to gain. The idea began with something simple: a casual glance at a stack of unopened mail on the kitchen counter. Margaret had been sorting through it while he was making coffee. Among the envelopes was one from her insurance provider, which she had left in plain sight before stepping away. Robert's eyes lingered on it. He didn't say a word, but when she left the room, he noted exactly where she put it down. Later, when Margaret went out to the garden, he walked past the counter and slipped the envelope into his pocket. He didn't open it right away. He knew better than to appear too interested, but just holding it gave him the first concrete thread of a plan. That night, in the privacy of his room, he carefully slit open the envelope and read the contents. The letter confirmed a recent update to her life insurance policy, something Margaret had done only weeks before his release. The change named him as a beneficiary alongside Ellen. To Margaret, it had been an act of trust, a gesture to show that he was part of her family now. To Robert, it was an invitation. He sat there for a long time, the paper trembling slightly in his hands, the numbers running through his mind. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to start over somewhere far away, enough to put an end to the uncertainty of his future. From that moment, his outlook shifted entirely. The warmth and gratitude he had displayed over the last 2 days became little more than a mask. He began watching Ellen more closely. She visited almost every day, sometimes bringing groceries, sometimes just keeping her mother company. Robert noticed the way she parked her small sedan in the same spot in the driveway, the way she carried a leather tote bag that always seemed full, and how she often stayed past dark before leaving. He studied her patterns the same way he studied the layout of the house, where the light switches were, which floorboards creaked, how long it took the back porch light to flicker on after being switched. Robert told himself he wasn't in a rush. If he was going to act, it had to be timed perfectly. Any mistake would mean losing everything. He thought about making it look like an accident, but the house's design didn't lend itself to that. A burglary gone wrong seemed more believable. He imagined the scene in detail: the back door forced open, drawers pulled out, jewelry scattered, the right amount of chaos to convince the police it had been random. The more he pictured it, the more real it became. Margaret, meanwhile, remained completely unaware. She spent the day doing small household tasks, sometimes chatting with Robert about the garden or the weather. She felt a quiet satisfaction that things seemed to be working out. Even Ellen, though still watchful, was beginning to accept his presence. Robert encouraged that, keeping his voice soft and his demeanor calm when she was around. He knew trust would make everything easier. Late that evening, Robert stepped outside under the pretense of having a cigarette. The night was cool, the street dimly lit. He walked slowly to the shed at the far end of the yard, making sure no neighbors were watching. Inside, he found a collection of tools Margaret kept neatly organized. His eyes landed on a hammer. Heavy, solid, the kind with a worn wooden handle that fit perfectly in his grip. He picked it up, feeling its weight. It wasn't time yet, but he wanted to know exactly where it was. Setting it back in place, he closed the shed door quietly and returned inside. As he climbed into bed that night, Robert's mind was clear. The decision had already been made. What remained was execution. He told himself it would be quick, that neither Margaret nor Ellen would see it coming. He even convinced himself that it was justified, that after everything he had lost, he had deserved the chance this would give him. In the darkness of the room, with the muffled sounds of the house settling around him, Robert began counting the hours until he would act. The third day began quietly, with the kind of stillness that hides the weight of what is coming. Margaret woke early, making tea in the kitchen while Robert sat at the table pretending to read the newspaper. He scanned the headlines without absorbing a single word, his thoughts locked on the plan that had been growing sharper in his mind. Ellen was expected later in the afternoon, and that gave him the window he needed. He listened carefully as Margaret spoke about errands she wanted to run, nodding as if engaged, but every sentence she said was measured against his timetable. The day passed slowly, each hour stretching longer than the last. Robert moved about the house in a deliberate, almost methodical way. He checked the locks on the windows, not to secure the home, but to make sure they looked untouched for later. He straightened the cushions on the couch and glanced over the layout of the living room, imagining where he would stand and how quickly he could cross the distance between himself and his targets. The hammer from the shed had been moved earlier that morning. He had placed it in a spot behind the couch, where it could be reached in seconds. Ellen arrived around 4 o'clock. The sound of her car pulling into the driveway drawing Margaret to the window. She waved happily as her daughter stepped out, carrying a bag of groceries. Robert stayed seated, offering a polite nod when Ellen entered. The air in the house shifted subtly. Ellen's presence always brought more conversation, more noise, but to Robert it felt like a countdown had begun. Every smile, every small act of kindness between the two women felt like a curtain closing, bringing the moment he had been waiting for closer. The afternoon wore on. They shared tea at the kitchen table, talked about the weather, and discussed small-town gossip. Robert kept to the edges of the conversation, occasionally making a comment so he wouldn't seem withdrawn. Margaret's trust in him appeared complete. Ellen, though still guarded, had stopped glancing at him with suspicion. He could see her easing into the belief that he was harmless. That was exactly what he wanted. By early evening, the light outside began to fade. The house grew quieter as the hum of the day settled into evening stillness. Robert could feel his pulse quicken, but outwardly he remained calm. He offered to bring in the small table from the back porch, stepping outside briefly to check the street. No one was walking by, and the neighboring houses were dark. It was the kind of night where people stayed indoors, where nothing unusual would be noticed until the morning. When he came back inside, he could hear Margaret and Ellen in the living room, their voices warm with the ease of shared history. He walked past them once, heading toward his room, then returned, standing near the back of the couch. The hammer was within reach. For a few moments, he simply stood there, his gaze fixed, not on them but on the space between, measuring distance, timing, and the angle of approach. The moment itself was sudden, almost without warning to the victims. He moved quickly, his footsteps masked by the carpet, his grip firm on the hammer's handle. The first strike landed before either could react. Margaret's cry was cut short as he turned on Ellen, ensuring she had no time to escape. The violence was swift, deliberate, and carried out with the cold focus of someone who had rehearsed every motion in his mind. In less than a minute, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Robert stood still for several seconds, breathing heavily, scanning the room to make sure nothing had been left out of place that might contradict the story he would later tell. The hammer, now streaked with blood, was set aside carefully. He didn't look at their faces. Instead, he focused on the next step, making it appear that what had happened was nothing more than a burglary gone wrong. He walked to the hallway, pulling open drawers, scattering their contents across the floor. In the bedroom, he tipped over a jewelry box, pocketing a few items to later discard or sell. The back door was left ajar, as though an intruder had fled in haste. He moved with purpose, each motion part of the script he had been writing in his head since the moment he read that insurance letter. When he was done, Robert returned to his room. He washed his hands, changed his shirt, and placed the stained one into a plastic bag he planned to throw away, far from the house. He lay down on the bed, staring at the ceiling in the dim light, listening to the unnatural quiet of a house where 2 lives had been violently ended. In his mind, the hardest part was over. What remained was to wait for the right moment to act surprised, to call for help, and to collect what he believed he had earned. Robert wasted no time once the room was staged to his satisfaction. He knew the longer he lingered, the greater the chance that something in his movements would leave a trail. His mind was cold, organized, and methodical. He walked through each room slowly, scanning for anything that might suggest the violence had been deliberate, rather than impulsive. A lamp on the side table was nudged slightly to the left, as though knocked during a struggle. A chair was pulled at an awkward angle, positioned to look like it had been bumped in panic. These details, he believed, would convince investigators that chaos had unfolded quickly, without thought or planning. In the kitchen, he rifled through a drawer, scattering utensils across the countertop and letting one clatter to the floor. He opened the pantry and moved a few items, creating the impression that someone had searched for valuables wherever they could. The goal wasn't to make it look perfectly logical. It was to make it look real, like the hurried, sloppy work of a desperate thief. From there, he returned to Margaret's bedroom. This was where he needed to be most careful. On the dresser sat a small locked box where she kept personal papers. He pried it open with a screwdriver, slipping the important documents into a folder he had brought from his own room. The life insurance paperwork was folded neatly, its edges tucked inside his jacket. That was the true prize, more valuable to him than any jewelry or cash he could find. He took a few gold necklaces and a pair of earrings, knowing he could pawn them later to create the appearance that robbery was the motive. He moved to Ellen's room next. Her belongings were fewer, but he made sure to upend her purse on the bed, scattering its contents before removing a small amount of cash from her wallet. He left the empty wallet open, hoping it would be another detail pointing to theft. Her phone, lying on the nightstand, was powered off and slipped into the bottom of his jacket pocket. He would throw it away later, somewhere it could never be linked back to him. Once he had everything he wanted, Robert turned his attention to the back door. He retrieved a small crowbar from the shed and used it to pry the door frame, just enough to leave marks. He wanted investigators to believe someone had forced their way inside. He even left the crowbar just outside on the grass, as if dropped in the intruder's haste to leave. Every step was calculated to plant the idea of an outsider, someone unknown, dangerous, and long gone by the time the crime was discovered. The next phase was about Robert himself. He needed to appear shocked, devastated, and above all, innocent. He returned to his room, placing his folder of stolen documents inside his duffel bag. The blood-stained hammer was wrapped in an old towel and put into a plastic trash bag. That bag was hidden in the trunk of Ellen's car, which sat in the driveway. He figured that if police believed the car was part of the burglary scene, they might overlook the bag or assume it belonged to Ellen. Later, he would retrieve it and dispose of it somewhere far from Millbrook. Before calling anyone, he sat on the edge of his bed and rehearsed his story. He would say he had been in his room reading when he heard noises, but thought nothing of it at first. Then he would claim he emerged to find the back door open and the house in disarray, only to discover Margaret and Ellen already gone. The emotion in his voice would have to be convincing, fear, grief, and confusion in equal measure. But the timing of the call was crucial. If he made it too soon, suspicion might fall on him for not intervening. Too late, and people might question why he hadn't checked on them earlier. He decided to wait until morning. That way, he could say he had gone to bed early and only found them when he awoke. It would give him hours to move about freely and ensure there was nothing left to connect him to the crime. The night stretched on, heavy and oppressive. Robert did not sleep. He paced the small space of his room, listening for any sound outside that might signal a neighbor stirring. Every so often, he checked the time, counting down to when he would finally make the call. The folder with the insurance documents sat under his duffel bag, untouched but never out of his awareness. By dawn, the plan was ready. He would stumble into the living room in the early light, act as if he had just discovered the scene, and dial for help. The image of himself standing in that room, feigning horror as he spoke to the dispatcher, was already clear in his mind. In Robert's thoughts, this was the turning point, the moment when he would shift from suspect in his own mind to survivor in everyone else's. What he couldn't see hidden in the quiet corners of the house and the street beyond were the pieces of evidence already in place that would soon dismantle his carefully built lie. The morning arrived with a pale, cold light spilling across the small house. Robert had been awake for hours, pacing, checking the clock, rehearsing his voice in his head. When he finally stepped into the living room, the scene was exactly as he had left it. Scattered objects, open drawers, the back door ajar, He took a deep breath, forcing his face into an expression of alarm before reaching for the phone. His voice shook just enough when he spoke to the emergency dispatcher, describing what he claimed to have just found. He said the words carefully, letting his tone rise and fall in the right places to convey shock and grief. Within minutes, sirens were cutting through the stillness of the street. The first officers entered cautiously, scanning the rooms as Robert stood off to the side, arms folded tight against his chest. He made a show of looking away from the covered bodies, as though unable to bear the sight. One of the officers began asking him questions immediately. When he had last seen Margaret and Ellen, whether he had noticed anything unusual the night before, if anything was missing. Robert gave his prepared answers smoothly, slipping in small details meant to guide the narrative toward a break-in. He mentioned the open door, the missing jewelry, the crowbar left on the lawn. For a while it seemed as though the officers were accepting the story. They moved through the house, taking notes and photographs, their expressions serious, but not accusatory. Robert allowed himself to believe it might actually work, that his careful planning had paid off. But in the corner of the living room, a uniformed officer was examining something small, an object on the floor near the couch. It was a faint smear, barely visible against the carpet, but the officer marked it quickly and spoke quietly to his partner. Robert noticed the exchange and felt a prickle of unease. Later, as detectives arrived, the questions became sharper. They wanted exact times when he had gone to bed, when he had woken, how long he had waited before calling. They asked him to walk them through his actions the previous evening. He repeated his story, but one of the detectives wrote something down without looking at him, a gesture that unsettled him more than any direct challenge could have. They requested to see his hands, and he extended them, hiding the faint soreness in his right wrist from gripping the hammer the night before. Outside, a small crowd of neighbors had gathered behind the yellow police tape. Robert could feel their eyes on him as he stepped out to get some air at an officer's suggestion. Their faces were a mix of shock and suspicion. A woman whispered something to the man beside her, both of them glancing in his direction. The isolation he had planned for, making sure no one saw anything, was now working against him. No one could confirm his version of events. As the investigation unfolded, small cracks in his plan widened. The security camera on the side of a neighbor's garage, which he had never noticed, had captured him walking to the shed late the previous night and returning with something in his hand. The footage wasn't perfectly clear, but the timing alone undermined his claim of having gone to bed early. Inside the house, fingerprints on the hammer matched his, and despite his attempt to hide it in Ellen's car, an officer had found the bag during an initial sweep. The towel wrapped around the weapon carried traces of both Margaret's and Ellen's blood. Detectives also uncovered the life insurance paperwork in his duffel bag. When confronted about it during a follow-up interview, Robert claimed he had been keeping it safe for Margaret, but the explanation was thin. Combined with the recent update naming him as a beneficiary, the papers began to look less like coincidence and more like motive. His calm demeanor during questioning began to crack. Answers became shorter, his tone sharp. 2 days after the killings, Robert was formally arrested. The news spread quickly through Millbrook, the headline in the local paper carrying a mix of disbelief and grim inevitability. For those who had doubted him from the start, it was confirmation. For Margaret's friends and neighbors, it was a betrayal almost too large to comprehend. A kindness repaid with calculated violence. In court, the evidence stacked against him, piece by piece. The hammer, the fingerprints, the video footage, the insurance documents, all pointed in the same direction. The prosecution painted a picture of a man who had stepped out of prison not to rebuild his life, but to take one. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on both counts of murder. Robert Kane was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He sat motionless as the sentence was read, staring straight ahead. The same cold calculation that had guided him through the crime seemed to drain from him in that moment, replaced by something hollow. He would leave the courthouse in shackles, returning not to the uncertain freedom he had squandered, but to the walls he had once longed to escape. In Millbrook, the Henson house remained empty for months. The garden overgrown, the windows shuttered. Neighbors passed by quietly, remembering the woman who had believed in second chances and the daughter who had stayed close to care for her. The story would linger in the town for years, retold as a warning